With Genshin Impact 3.0, we not only got the region of Sumeru, but we got the long-anticipated Dendro element finally in the game. But along with it, we got a myriad of different reactions and a lot of different ways that it can actually work. So today we're going to help alleviate that. Hi, my name is Blossums and welcome to another Genshin Impact video, and today we're going to go over each and every one of the different Dendro elements and how they interact. We're also going to be going over how that damage is calculated. Don't worry, I'm not going to throw a bunch of equations at you. We'll talk about it in simple terms. And then we're also going to talk about how it interacts with some of the elements that it doesn't necessarily have a reaction with, because pretty much every single element got some sort of boon or buff from Dendro in one way or another, except for Geo, which kind of got left out in the cold, unfortunately. And now Geo is definitely the most boring element, to put it lightly. But that's a topic for a whole nother video. Let's go ahead and talk about some of these Dendro reactions. First up, we'll talk about the reactions in general, and then we're going to go over each and every one of those separate reactions. And what I mean by in general is that these are largely into categories that you may be familiar with, that being the transformative reaction category and the amplifying reaction category. And what I mean by this is if you go to any of your characters and you go to details and you go to the elemental mastery tab and hit the question mark here, it is going to show you the different scaling that elemental mastery has for every different reaction. And if you notice, the Dendro reactions of Burning, Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon have a different scalar from Aggravate and Spread. And this is because the reactions of Burning, Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon don't have the chance to scale with your crit multipliers similarly to Electrocharged. However, things like Aggravate and Spread do scale with your crit multipliers similarly to Vaporize and Melt. So they balance that out by basically allowing your Burning, Bloom, and Hyperbloom to be dealing much more damage when scaled with Elemental Mastery compared to the damage bonus that other reactions get, like Vaporize or Melt. And you'll also notice here that the actual difference between them is pretty interesting, because here on the transformative reaction category, we get 147, but then we go to the Aggravate and Spread, we get about half of that, and then Vaporize and Melt get about half of that. So that's already telling you how valuable Elemental Mastery is going to be to your Dendro reactions, regardless of whether they're transformative or amplifying, because this is still contributing a pretty good amount to that actual reaction. And this is a pretty decent generalization of how that damage is calculated for those different reactions, because of course these all still deal different damage. My Overload and Electrocharge numbers are still going to be different despite them scaling the same off Elemental Mastery, and that's because there is a base calculation for Overload and Electrocharge, similar to how there is still a base calculation for things like Burning, Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon, same with Aggravate and Spread, and Vaporize and Melt. But this is still a good way to categorize the importance of Elemental Mastery, crit rate, and crit damage for the units you're going to be using for the reactions you plan on using. This is also a good way to remember which ones are the transformative reactions and which one are the amplifying reactions, as they are separate. So up here with the other transformative reactions, you have your Burning, Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon, and then the amplifying reactions have their own separate tabs, so if you ever forget, this is a good place to check. So first up, we'll show off the Burning reaction, which is just a simple Pyro and Dendro reaction there, and you see you get a small damage over time, and it actually keeps the Pyro aura over the enemy there, and you can keep applying the Dendro aura to keep causing these burning reactions. It's all going to be dependent on the internal cooldown of the character and how often they can apply Dendro. But the nice part about the burning reaction is that you don't need a consistent Pyro applier, because it just keeps applying the Pyro reaction after you do a burning reaction there. So that is a very nice aspect to it. And you can also follow this up with a Hydro character to get a proper Vaporize and deal really big amounts of damage. Alright, and next up is your standard Bloom reaction. This is one of our other basic reactions, and this is just the interaction between Dendro and Hydro. And when you do them, you're going to create these Dendro cores on the ground, and after a set period of time, they're going to explode. And if you notice there, it not only did damage to the Ruin Guard, but it did damage to me as well. It does damage in a small radius. It doesn't do the same amount of damage to you. It's only a small percentage of that, it seems. And there's also the stipulation that there can only be 5 cores on the ground at any given time, and if you create one after that, the oldest one is just going to disappear. Essentially, it won't necessarily necessarily blow up to get rid of itself. But that is how your standard bloom reaction works. And you'll also want to note one other thing, is that when you cause the bloom reaction, it takes both the dendro and the hydro reaction away. Alright, and next up we'll talk about some of the more complicated reactions, and these are just extensions of bloom really. So when you do bloom and you create the dendro core, you can also react with the dendro core. So if you apply pyro, you're going to create the burgeon reaction, and that's going to deal AoE damage as well. And I believe it does more damage to you, but it also deals more damage than your standard bloom. Now if you do dendro, hydro, and then you apply electro to your dendro core, then you're going to cause the Hyperbloom reaction. And the difference on this one, as you note there, is that it has kind of a heat-seeking missile type of function to where it just homes in on the enemy. So the difference between them is that, of course, the Burgeon reaction is going to deal more AoE, and the Hyperbloom is going to deal more single target focused damage. So it's important to note that Bloom and Burgeon both can hurt you, but they have that added benefit of being able to do some really solid AoE. Hyperbloom, on the other hand, is relatively safe and has a nice homing function to it, and both of those reactions actually deal really good damage and scale really well with Elemental Mastery. And that's it for the transformative reactions of Dendro. Now let's talk a little bit about the amplifying reactions. And both of the amplifying reactions work with the reaction of Electro and Dendro. So when you apply Electro and then you apply Dendro, you're going to cause the Quicken reaction. And the Quicken reaction itself doesn't deal damage, but what it does is a little bit unique in the fact that it applies an aura to the enemy that if you follow up soon after doing the Quicken reaction with either Dendro or Electro, it's going to deal Aggravate or Spread. So let's go ahead and show that out. And so we got Quicken there, and then I'll follow up with another Electro attack after the internal cooldown's over, and it does Aggravate there. And the interesting part about Aggravate is that it can also crit there. So when I do the Quicken and this boomerang is going to come back, it did the Spread reaction, and you saw that it also crit there, and that I can still follow this up again to deal a Quicken or an Aggravate. If I was quick enough, we could have followed that up with an Aggravate. And you see that it also keeps the Electro aura over the enemy. So that's something to keep in mind. This is probably one of the stronger reactions of Dendro, and it's pretty cool, but it can get interrupted. So when we do the Quicken effect, you can still bloom with something like the Hydro effect, and it's actually going to take away your Quicken aura. So that's very important to keep in mind. So see, we'll Quicken here, and we'll use something like Hydro, and it did the bloom effect, and it took away my ability to Aggravate. So do keep that in mind. It can get in the way, and you're just going to have to account for that in your different team comps, because it could be beneficial to still have a Hydro unit on an Aggravate team. However, on another note, if you're quick enough and you do the Quicken reaction and you swap to a Pyro character, it will activate Burning, but if you come back to your Electro character, you can Overload and Aggravate. So that's something to keep in mind as well, and another interesting team idea, because you could have some combination of Burning, Overload, and Aggravate, which I think has some interesting potential. But as I said, that's only if you're quick enough, because it seems you keep the Quicken aura there for only a small window of time there, so it is technically possible to Aggravate and Overload, but it's going to be pretty difficult to actually maximize on that potential. Other noteworthy aspects to Aggravate and Spread is that they both do have different base scalars for their damage. Spread actually deals a little bit more damage at base than Aggravate does, so do keep that in mind when you're trying to build your Aggravate or Spread teams. The difference isn't staggering, so keep that in mind as well. It's not a major deal, but it is important for how you're going to be building your team. Whether you're going to want your Electro unit to be the one dealing the damage most often, or if you're going to want to have your Dendro unit being the damage dealer. But remember, all of these still check your Elemental Mastery, and it's going to check whoever activates the reaction's Elemental Mastery. So if I do Bloom with Kokomi's normal attack, it's going to check her Elemental Mastery. If I cause the Bloom with the main character there, then it's going to check their Elemental Mastery. So the same rules apply as they do for pretty much every other element. It's going to check whoever actually causes the reaction, so keep that one in mind. So that's it for all the actual Dendro elemental reactions, but what about the non-reaction interactions with the other elements like Anemo and Cryo? Because as I said, pretty much everything got some sort of boon or buff from Dendro, other than the sad Geo. So although Cryo and Anemo don't necessarily react with Dendro, they still have an interaction with it, and we're going to talk about those now. So first up, we'll talk about the way Dendro and Cryo actually react, and they don't, but however, you'll notice they both still keep their auras applied to the enemy, and yeah, you can react with the both of them. As you saw with Razor there, I just got a Quicken and a Superconduct at the same time, and then followed up with an Aggravate. So low-key awesome Razor buff, by the way, but yeah, that's pretty cool. Because the possibilities for this get really interesting the more you look into it, because you Cryo and then you Dendro, and then look at this, I can melt and burn the enemy, which really sets up some interesting team combos moving forward. So while the interaction between Cryo and Dendro is pretty cool and has some really cool potential between Electro and Pyro, it gets a little weird with Hydro. And what I mean by this is, if you notice in the first clip, I was able to bloom and freeze simultaneously, but this isn't always true. Sometimes it doesn't work like that, and you don't get both simultaneously, but if I followed up here, I still get the burning and melt reaction on the enemy, but I never got a bloom reaction, and that seems more of the common case. Being able to freeze and bloom simultaneously seems to be the more rare scenario. It might have to do something with the whole elemental aura, stacking and how that all works. You notice there I was able to do both simultaneously, so I have a feeling that goes more into the elemental aura theory, to where there's like certain amounts of a certain applied element, and that matters for different things. You see we didn't get the bloom and the freeze there, but then if I follow up I still get burning, so it's a little wonky in that capacity when it comes to freezing specifically when you're working with Cryo and Dendro, so just remember that one, but you can still do it. As I said, it seems a little weird and a little bit glitchy, but overall does kind of work. Next up, we'll talk about Anemo and how it works with Dendro, and it's actually kind of nice that it doesn't have a specific reaction with Dendro, nor can Anemo swirl Dendro. And the reason this is good is for a couple of reasons. One of the main ones being that you can focus in which element you want to swirl and therefore debuff with something like the Viridescent Veneer, but there are also a couple other interactions that we're going to talk about first, namely the interaction with something like the Dendro cores. When you produce one, any Anemo character that has some sort of crowd control or suck potential, they can move those Dendro cores, as you saw. And another really cool aspect to this is if you have a character like Kazuha specifically, who can also have some elemental absorption, means that when he comes back down, he's going to cause something like the Burgeon reaction there, depending on what element he absorbs. The same is for something like Hyperbloom. But not only that, when you cause a swirl reaction with an Anemo character, the swirl itself is going to be able to cause those different Dendro reactions. All right, this one's a little bit harder to showcase, but we'll go ahead and create a Dendro core here, and then we'll move away and we'll apply our Pyro, and then we'll swirl, and you saw that that caused the Burgeon reaction itself because we swirled the enemy with a different element, and you're going to be able to do that in a lot of different team comps. That was just an example there for you. Circling back to what I was talking about, being able to focus what you want to swirl, since Anemo doesn't swirl Dendro, if you're running some sort of team to where you're using, say, Electro and Dendro, you're running an Aggravate team, you can focus that your Electro is going to be the thing that you can go ahead and swirl there, because it's the only thing that Anemo can swirl, meaning that you can focus in on that specific debuff or buff depending on your Anemo character and their myriad of usual buffs that they do via swirl. So yeah, even though Anemo doesn't actually react with Dendro, the way you can utilize it with other characters that do makes it still very strong with Dendro. Even characters like Sayu have really gotten a bump in their usability just because of her elemental absorption factor and her really good swirl capabilities. But I do think that's going to be about it for today's video. I tried to go over each and everything I could possibly think about when it comes to Dendro reactions and interactions, and covered pretty much everything I could think of. there are some really cool, interesting things that happen with Dendro, and it's a little wacky sometimes, especially with the whole freezing things and then being able to melt them afterward, and sometimes getting the bloom on the freeze. I feel like that one's a little glitchy, but the interactions and team potentials are very cool. I'm very excited for more characters to come out so we can build even more teams. But for now, I'm going to be preoccupied making some different teams with Dendro because it is a really cool element to interact with and utilize some old characters that just have a new, fresh kind of take on them just because they can interact with this new element in a fun way. But let me know how you're enjoying Dendro, if you're enjoying it at all. And hopefully this helped you out, realize some potential combinations that you didn't know before. But other than that, I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day. My name is Blossoms, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.